Hey everyone, what you're about to watch is a video I did for Ken McElroy on why I really don't like Series LLCs. So if you like this content, I'd encourage you to check out kenmcelroy.com, and here we go. Hey everyone, Mauricio here, kenmcelroy.com, legal advisor, and today we're going to talk about the Series LLC and why I really don't like it. It's funny, we were actually, Ken and I were in the happy hour yesterday, and this was one of the questions that came up in the live, and the question was simply, should I use Series LLCs? And what I said yesterday was, if you ask 100 asset protection attorneys, probably around 60 of them will say they don't really like Series LLCs, and the other 40 or so will actually like them. So this is not something that everybody agrees on, but my personal opinion is stay away from Series LLCs. But the purpose of this video is to explain what they are, and then we'll go through the reasons that I recommend my clients to avoid Series LLCs and go with a more traditional structure. So before we get into the Series LLC, let's go through what the traditional structure is and really talk about why the Series LLC even came up in the first place and what issues it's trying to address. So as you guys know from prior videos, generally speaking, we want to have each individual property in its own limited liability company, its own LLC, because this way, if something happens to one of these properties, only the LLC that owns the property is going to be legally responsible. So if something were to happen in this property, for example, then there's a lawsuit, there's a slip and fall, there's a pipe that explodes, what have you, then the LLC will get sued, and if there's a judgment against the LLC, only this property is at risk, right? So you might lose the equity in this property and whatever cash this LLC will have, but it's not going to affect the other three properties because they are legally protected in the entity. Now, the main problem with this structure is, you can think about this, each LLC is going to probably cost anywhere from $500 to $1,000 to set up. You've got registered agent fees that you've got to worry about, and you've got filing fees. So the cost to set these up starts to get expensive, and the cost to maintain these LLCs start to become expensive, especially if you start growing your portfolio and end up with 10, 15, 20 properties. You can see that all of these LLCs will actually add up. And so that's the problem that the Series LLC was really trying to solve, is how do we keep this protection in place but mitigate the cost? How do we set this up so that the investor doesn't have to pay all these fees to set up and maintain, but we continue to maintain this legal separation and asset protection? So when you create a Series LLC, you actually start by creating what we would call the parent LLC, and it's just like any other, really like any other LLC. It's just at the time you form this LLC in whatever state you're going to do it in, you just have to check the box and let the state know that this is a Series LLC, and pursuant to the state statutes, there's usually some specific articles of incorporation or articles of organization that we have to prepare. It's not often a form, but we actually have to do a little bit more in-depth filing with the Series LLC. But essentially, we create one Series LLC, which is called the parent. Now, with the parent LLC, we draft a pretty comprehensive operating agreement, probably a little bit more comprehensive than your usual operating agreement. You might see a 50, 60, 80-page operating agreement. But this is the LLC, this is the main LLC, and in that operating agreement, we're going to state that we're going to create these, what we call series, right? They're not actually separate entities, but they're like, some people call them cells, I sometimes call them sleeves, but they're really called series. And these are not anything that you would actually go out and file with a particular state. These are just internal documents that we prepare to establish these cells. So in order to represent that, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take off the LLC, and I'm going to put these into little dotted lines to represent this is not a separate legal entity that we file, but it's just a sub-filing of the major LLC. So again, each of these sleeves or series are not a separate filing that we do with the state. It's just an internal document preparation. We literally prepare a 1 to 2 page document that sets these things up, but there's no separate filing. So typically this is what we call the parent company, which is the parent LLC, and these are Series 1, Series 2, and you can call these anything you want, right? They don't have to be called series. You can call them anything you want, but they all have their individual names, but they all belong to the master parent LLC. So we've created the master parent LLC, and now we've created these Series LLCs with simple internal documents where we'll simply, or just basically outline who the member is going to be, which is usually the parent LLC, and who's the manager of each individual series. The parent doesn't have to be the only member. You can have one of these series owned partially by the parent and partially by another member, but it's literally a simple 1-page, 2-page document that we prepare outlining, number 1, the existence of each series, and then number 2, who's the member, who's the manager, but that's it. There's no filing with the state. There's no really legally recognized separate entity. It's just a sleeve or a cell of the major parent LLC. So even though the statute has basically preserved the asset protection, meaning that preserved that each individual property is in its each individual sleeve, we haven't really created a separate entity, and that's probably one of the main problems when putting together a Series LLC. So let's talk about some of the issues that pop up with the Series LLC. First and foremost, these are really new statutes that have popped up. There hasn't been that much time that's gone by from the time the states have come up with the statutes and today, and so there's not a lot of legal precedence. So we don't really know if this structure that the states have come up with will actually pass muster and clear the court. In fact, it's not uncommon for a judge not to really even understand what the Series LLC because it's so brand new. So anytime you have a new statute that pops up, there's a lot of issues that are going to come up. We really don't know if this is going to legally pass muster. The second issue is that not every state has a Series LLC. There's only about 14 states that currently recognize Series LLCs. And one of the issues that's been coming up is people have been setting these up in states that obviously have the Series LLC, but they're operating in a different state. And so when they get sued for whatever reason in a state that doesn't recognize the LLC, the Series LLC, well, that creates a problem because at the end of the day, you've only got one LLC in those states. And so even though you think you might be protected by having every property in its own series or in its unique cell, at the end of the day, in those other states, you just have one LLC. So all of these LLCs essentially go back into the main LLC. You've got to be really, really careful to only set up these entities in the state that they recognize them and that you actually are doing the business. So hopefully that's where you reside, that's where your properties are located, and that's where the statute allows you to do that. But even then you've got issues because if you're traveling to a different state, you drive over the border and you get into a car accident in a state that doesn't recognize a Series LLC, well, that's one of the problems you're going to have. You're going to end up in court in a state that doesn't recognize the Series LLC. The third issue I have with Series LLCs is when it applies specifically to real estate. The first issue, for example, is just transferring title. Like when you transfer title into the Series LLC, where do you transfer title to? A lot of people make the mistake to transfer title specifically into one of these cells that really legally doesn't exist. And so they go down to the recorder's office and they provide the document to the recorder's office. They don't care. They're just going to file whatever you give them. And you end up holding title to your property in one of these Series LLCs and these series in one of these sleeves that isn't a legally recognized entity. And so that causes all kinds of trouble when it's time for you to go ahead and sell the property because title doesn't like it. You may have to transfer it out of the sleeve into your personal name or back into the parent LLC. It becomes messy. The way you're supposed to do it is actually transfer the deed into the parent company so that the parent LLC is the actual owner of the property, but you're supposed to put a little notation at the bottom of the deed that says, hey, this actually belongs to Series 1 or Series 3 or Series 4. As you can imagine, that doesn't really breed confidence, and a good attorney can probably poke holes into that by having a little footnote there. So there are other ways to get around that. We can use land trusts, we can use other entities, management companies, but as you can see, it's starting to get more and more complicated as we speak. Another issue that pops up with real estate is that you can't open bank accounts. Again, these series don't legally exist, and so a bank account has to be opened either in the name of the parent LLC or in the name of one of the managers. And so you have issues where it's really hard to delineate the ownership by having separate bank accounts. It's hard to get utilities. Let's say you bought a multifamily property and you want to transfer the utilities into the names of each of these series. Again, you can't do that because legally speaking, these Series LLCs don't exist. When you're entering into your lease agreements with your tenants, you can't do it with the Series LLC because it's not a legally recognized entity. You're going to have to enter into those lease agreements with your property manager most likely or your asset manager who can then handle all of the transactions with their bank account. So as you can tell, it just gets more and more messy as we go through the process in trying to fit a Series LLC, specifically when we're talking about real estate. And finally, for this to really work, you have to be really good at keeping records. You've got to keep really good records, otherwise you're going to lose a lot of protection. This is actually written into the specific statutes in the states that recognize LLCs. So if you're not very good at keeping track of your corporate records or making sure that these are set up properly where the leases are with the management agreement and you have separate bank accounts and then this and that, I mean, if you're not very good at that, you're going to have to outsource those things, and most of the people I know don't have the time or really spend that much attention with corporate formalities and corporate records, which is one of the reasons that people like LLCs. There aren't as much corporate formalities with an LLC than there are with a corporation, and so it just creates another barrier for you to be able to do a good Series LLC. So I'm not saying not to do it, I'm just saying I'm not a big fan of it. I think putting together a more traditional structure, yes, it costs a little bit of money, but the way I look at it is insurance. You end up spending $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000, which sounds like a lot of money, but if that insures you against having an issue with one of your properties and not making sure that they can't get to the others, I think that's money well spent. If you disagree with me, put a comment down below. I'd love to discuss this with you because, again, this is not a black and white issue, but I would love your comment, love your feedback. And if you found this video interesting, please subscribe.